Which books of the Bible were the first to be written, and which were the last to be written? Hey, everybody, I'm Dan McClellan. I'm a scholar of the Bible and religion, and most of the answers that I see to this question are presupposing the inerrancy, the historicity, the univocality of the entire Bible, as well as a bunch of post biblical traditions about authorship and date. For instance, some people will list Job as one of the first books written, not because anything in the text actually supports that, but because of post-biblical traditions about authorship and date. But Job is well off base. Job is a Persian period composition. It means that was written after around 539 BCE and before around 330 BCE. So it's quite late when it comes to the Hebrew Bible. Other folks will list Genesis. There is a tradition out there that Moses was the author of the entire Pentateuch. That's also not in the Bible. That's a post-biblical tradition, and there are no data that support that. The Pentateuch came together over several centuries as a variety of different authors and editors and redactors added more and more layers to this authoritative bit of political propaganda that probably has its origins in some legislation and some historical texts from the 8th or 7th centuries BCE. And so the overwhelming majority of Genesis is probably 8th century BCE at the earliest, with some tiny bits of poetry that might be earlier than that. And that's actually where we find the earliest parts of the Hebrew Bible, fragments of poetry that are embedded in longer pieces of poetry. So, for instance, the Song of Deborah in Judges 5 has some portions of it that are probably very, very old, may go back to around 1000 BCE or maybe a little earlier. The same may be true of some fragments of the poetry that we find in Genesis 49 or Psalm 68 or Exodus 15. These are poems that have some very old sections in them, and poetry comes earlier than historical narrative because we don't really have historical narrative in alphabetic scripts, and Hebrew is an alphabetic script, until the late 9th century BCE. So any historical narrative that we have written in Hebrew in the Hebrew Bible cannot predate the late 9th century BCE. And Hebrew itself as a language doesn't really predate around 1100 BCE. And this is one of the reasons the earliest parts of the Hebrew Bible, those poetic fragments, probably date to somewhere around 1000 BCE. So we don't have an entire book that was written down all at once anywhere near 1400 BCE or even 1000 BCE or even 800 BCE. We have a bunch of fragments that came together over time, and the earliest parts of those fragments are some poetic fragments that may go back to about 1000 BCE. Now, when it comes to the most recent books written, now we're talking about the New Testament. And traditionally, people will identify the book of Revelation written somewhere around 95 CE. But this is also inaccurate and is based on the presupposition of the inerrancy, the univocality, the historicity of all of the New Testament, as well as post-biblical traditions about authorship. But there are several texts in the New Testament that are pseudepigraphic. They were not written by who they claim to be written by. They were actually written much later, including some texts that were most likely written in the 2nd century CE, either in the first quarter or the second quarter of the 2nd century CE. Probably first quarter is the pastoral epistles. So that would be 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus. The majority of scholars agree these were not written by Paul. They were probably written decades after his death, toward the end of the 1st century, or more likely the beginning of the 2nd century CE. And then we have a text like 2 Peter, which was not written by Peter. And this is probably the most recently written text of the New Testament. Scholars think that 2 Peter was probably written between about 120 and maybe as late as 150 CE. So when it comes to the earliest texts, we just have some poetic fragments. When it comes to the latest texts, we have some pseudepigraphic New Testament texts like the pastoral epistles and like 2 Peter. So the range between the earliest and the latest texts of the entire Bible, somewhere around 1100, maybe 1150 years. And the fit for this video has been Gambit.